The rose garden of the United Nations is in full bloom at this time of year. No one's around to smell the roses. The noses of the UN are pointed at screens. The leaders are carrying on their conversations deliberately, slowly, and that goes on. But it is strange to see the building across the East River when I take the ferry boat, standing empty, largely empty. And the COVID-19 crisis has certainly changed things in many respects. The Secretary General Guterres has recently given a speech calling on the nations of the world to take this opportunity to lay down their arms.
Our world faces a common enemy, COVID-19. The virus does not care about nationality or ethnicity, faction or face. It attacks all relentlessly. Meanwhile, armed conflict rages on around the world. The most vulnerable, women and children, people with disabilities, the marginalized and displaced, pay the highest price. They are also at the highest risk of suffering devastating losses from COVID-19. Let's not forget that in war-ravaged countries, health systems have collapsed. Health professionals, already few in number, have often been targeted. Refugees and others displaced by violent conflict are doubly vulnerable. The fury of the virus illustrates the folly of war. That is why today I am calling for an immediate global ceasefire in all corners of the world. It is time to put armed conflict on lockdown and focus together on the true fight of our lives. To warring parties, I say, pull back from hostilities, put aside mistrust and animosity, silence the guns, stop the artillery, end the airstrikes. This is crucial to help create corridors for life-saving aid, to open precious windows for diplomacy, to bring hope to places among the most vulnerable to COVID-19. Let us take inspiration from coalitions and dialogue slowly taking shape among rival parties in some parts to enable joint approaches to COVID-19.
Welcome to the show, this new show, UN This Week. And my name is Adam Carroll with the Burma Task Force, a program of Justice for All. We're accredited with Department of Global Communications at the United Nations. And we're very happy to have as our first guest, Carl Murrell, Principal UN Representative of the Baha'i of the United States UN Office, and longtime presence at the UN, active in interfaith relations, civil society participation, and human rights protection. First, however, I'd like to mention the news because this is a very unusual time, as suggested by this slightly slapdash and stuttering video that we just saw about the shutdown of the UN. It does continue virtually in Geneva and in New York. Since mid-March, the suspension of in-person council meetings, that's the Security Council, has required unexpected decisions and drastic changes, according to the Security Council report. Council members have expressed frustration with some of the limitations of virtual negotiations. They note the virtual platform makes it difficult to read body language and to have the sort of quiet corridor conversations that may help during an impasse. They might also be less sense of pressure to compromise when not faced with 14 other members in the same room. Council members acknowledge that security concerns might make for less trust, essential tools in a diplomat's arsenal. And this is much more difficult in the virtual world. And this is the only the tip of the iceberg. Going forward with the Security Council, Germany has the presidency in July. There are 5 open debates planned this month. Early in the month, a high-level open debate on pandemics and security is anticipated. As mentioned in the video, Secretary General Guterres over 3.5 months ago, called for a global ceasefire. And it was only yesterday, 3.5 months later, that the Council was able to pass something that pleased all the Council members enough on this global pandemic. US and Russia and China have been fighting about minute details and whether the WHO, the World Health Organization, would be mentioned, and all of these things. These sometimes slow processes are why many people feel the UN is somewhat dysfunctional, but much goes on, and we'll be talking about the many layers at the UN. And for example, this week, a high-level open debate is planned to discuss peacekeeping and human rights. Germany also plans to hold a ministerial-level open debate on climate and security in late July. There are many other meetings ongoing on the disinformation pandemic, as well as sexual violence and various other things. And so the 75th anniversary of the UN signing the charter just passed last week. And almost around as long, the Baha'i Office is a very important player in the NGO community, the civil society presence at the UN. A longtime presence at the UN, our guest, Carl Murrell, began working at the UN office as an assistant in 1991 and became the principal UN representative in 2008. Previously, Carl studied philosophy and psychology and worked in the private sector in computer software development and securities investments. Mr. Murrell recently completed a term as president of the Committee of Religious NGOs at the United Nations. In addition, he served on the executive committee of the Council of Organizations of the UN Association and also co-chair of the Values Caucus at the UN. The Baha'i works on various topics such as UN and civil society, faith values in global affairs, and the advancement of women. And I hope we'll get a chance to discuss all these. The UN office is part of a larger network of the Baha'i International Community, a body that represents affiliates in over 180 countries and territories. The office registered with the UN as an NGO recognized by the Department of Public Information in 1948, and in 1970 was granted consultative status with the ECOSOC, which is UN Economic and Social Council. And then the Baha'i have been involved with many other children's and women's groups, and the High Commissioner of Human Rights and Refugees, UNESCO, and you name it. So we're very much looking to learn from your experience, and I'm very glad to have you on. We've very much valued the meetings that we've participated in. I'm thinking a couple of months before the pandemic started, a meeting in your offices with Adama Dieng and his colleagues from the Genocide Prevention Office. So you all are very involved with social justice work and building bridges on an interfaith basis. So I did want to ask, what is your, as a starting point, what is the framework that Baha'i have for this kind of engagement on a global level?
Well, the organizing framework that Baha'is use is the recognition of oneness of humankind and the unity of the Earth's inhabitants. And it's, it's a very difficult or it's not a simplistic aim. And we have so many, Baha'u'llah said that the light of unity, so powerful is the light of unity, that it can illuminate the whole earth. So when I think about that analogy, I think about what it will take for us to reach unity. Think about all of the problems we're having right now. You just outlined them in your opening remarks. and they were outlined a bit in the video from the UN. The conversations that we need to have, the reconceptions of what institutions mean, the reconceptions of our community, the reconceptions of us ourselves as individuals. It's a lot of thinking. So actually, I was thinking what we need to do maybe is ask more questions than provide more answers, to begin to rethink how we're going to go forward as a body of humanity. That's what the Bahai's work is to try to bring some of this thinking about reconceptualizing our human framework, our human organizing framework, into the UN conversation.
That suggests, at least to me, that the basis for building unity on a global level can also be the work to build inner unity on a spiritual level. And I know that there are people at the UN who value their work in those terms. But again, we're working, especially in the human rights field, very aware that nations are based on an ego level, it seems. And yet maybe this is too negative. Maybe there is a dimension of national consciousness, national identity that is directed or inspired by a sense of unity, a sense of purpose beyond interest. People talk about, the challenge of climate change, huge challenges of peace and security. So these challenges are so huge, it's daunting. But there are people not just tilting at windmills, but trying to really build a better world. And I think that one of the buzzwords currently is build it back better, which, after the COVID-19 crisis, it's nice to think about an after. But patience and that kind of attitude with patience with the diplomatic process. What are your experiences in your role? How do you see faith-based NGOs? Are they accepted? Is their role expanding, contracting? How do you see the field?
Adam, from the point of view of the UN and many people who view the organization, it sees religion as a problem, right? So it talks about the strife and the various ways that religious institutions affect human rights. But if you talk to adherents, if you talk to individuals, many of the ways that they find sustenance and they find inspiration for human rights efforts and striving for human rights and acknowledging human rights is their faith. And I've even, so you mentioned I am co-chair of the Values Caucus. And so at one time we used to have informal off the record conversations with ambassadors. And they acknowledged the importance of values in their societies. And they acknowledged that there was, let's say, a spiritual component in their societies, and that they adhere to as individuals. But where they struggled was to reconcile that with the legislative aspect of the work, and they're responsible for the work of their capitals, so which is a contentious sphere. And until that changes, then we'll have the results that we have right now. And where we have cooperation between states and nations in various ways, we see tremendous strides forward.
You were also heading the Committee of Freedom of Religion and Belief.
Committee of Religious NGOs.
Yeah. And I believe that is the group that has had many events this just before, and even some Zoom events, I think. I have here June 3rd the meeting with U.S. Commission for International Religious Freedom, Tony Perkins, Gail Manchin, Elizabeth Cassidy, talking about countries of particular concern. Before that, I saw another meeting, Religious Freedom Developments in India, in May, which I know it has anti-Muslim laws, and we have a fair amount of programming on our sister program, the Justice for All Now, about the various challenges of the Citizenship Amendment Bill in India. And then I see that also there's other meetings with the U.S. mission, and that was hosted at the Baha'i International Community's UN office. So it's great to have these various the access, because it doesn't come easily. They can't come to everyone's meeting.
That's right.
And you all are known as a convener, and you have wonderful office space. So I just wondered if you could reflect on that role of being a convener.
You know, my assumption is, and you know, you've worked with the organization. Governments are very sensitive to bias. They're sensitive to sort of being put on notice, if you will.
Mm.
They are happy to have civil society advice, but they are not happy to be called out in public spaces. So
Mm-hmm.
what I think the Baha'i community provides is a unifying space where governments and civil society can have a civil discussion. And we must have these discussion with that atmosphere, or then it'll be like everything else, which are conversations rooted in problems and fault finding, and not rooted in ways forward which work for everyone in the room.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, there's enough finger pointing, and yet, as an advocacy organization, finger pointing is one of the tools we use.
Right.
But then there needs to be space for dialogue, and those two postures don't always go together comfortably.
That's right.
And certainly, when you listen to speeches in the Human Rights Council or elsewhere, they can be very disappointing with a kind of blame game. So we want our own NGO wants to be a force for positive change and engagement. And, you know, we're just one of many. There aren't that many Muslim American organizations that are at the UN.
Right.
And so we hope that we can continue to, you know, develop that role. With other faith communities, I know the Vatican has a representative, and and there are quite a range of religious and spiritual groups at the UN. What is that year like in terms of religious engagement? How would you describe, for people who don't know, you know, the kind of usual pre-pandemic scheduling of religious meetings?
Well, we have the Committee of Religious NGOs, which this year is almost entirely focused on the environment and sustainable development, and they have a lot of participants on that committee now who that is their main focus. So that's the focus of that group. The Committee of Freedom of Religion or Belief obviously focuses on that topic, but to the extent where they can form a strong relationship with the UN conveners of that, is how their work will be regarded. And when they have a strong relationship with the observers of that for the UN, then they have an opportunity to have civil society input. And I'm not really that well connected with that committee this year.
Hmm.
I sort of moved away for the last year and a half or so because the issue of race in the U.S. was becoming such a thing that I
Hmm.
began to go away a bit from the UN and focus on the United States issue with that, and
Hmm.
travel the country around a bit and learn about this issue, which we now have seen has come to a head at the moment.
Hmm. I think that your office has other staff also working on
Yes.
related topics.
Yeah.
When I saw the list of staff, I thought that was quite interesting, and obviously much to be done, whether it's race or xenophobia on other bases.
That's right.
Blaming the other is a huge rising trend, fed by the internet, fed by nationalism, and so forth.
That's right.
With your work on that, I'm wondering. Recently, there was some. I think George Floyd's brother went to Geneva or engaged with the Human Rights Council in Geneva. I was wondering if you could say something about that.
So an African nation, I think it's Guinea-Bissau, put forth an urgent call for what they call an urgent debate in the UN human rights mechanism in Geneva around the killing of George Floyd and police violence. And it was unanimously adopted. And the hearing happened. George Floyd's brother did make a statement remotely, and uh, a number of heads or of officials in various countries made remote statements, but quite a few were there. And I was surprised at how many statements were made that I felt were sincere reflections upon the misuse of police forces in various countries,
Hmm.
and how people of color, and particularly people of African descent in the various countries, uh, might not be treated as fairly as other citizens. And it was touching to see those remarks, to hear those remarks, and see those representatives giving those remarks.
It it was surprising and also touching, I thought, to see how the movement suddenly inspired people in other countries,
That's right.
both on behalf of American, American communities of color, and also their own minorities. And in Burma, for example, where the Rohingya are
Mhm.
targeted on the basis of their religion, but also on the basis of their color, and they're called Kalar.
That's right.
And so they had a sudden movement called "I Am Not Kalar,"
Right.
and so there were, there's been uh, a lot of alignment on a global level, which has been quite interesting, and maybe uh, some opportunity for hope. There's on the other hand, there could be some aspect of hysteria because I mean, I hate to. That sounds like a dismissal, but we're all on lockdown, and I think there's a bit of that in the mix. As far as people going out and protesting, but there's seems to be something happening. And I'm wondering, as far as what comes next on Black Lives Movement
Right.
in Geneva or at the UN, is there more that can happen? Are there special rapporteurs who can come in and get involved in research, or is there something more?
Yeah, I mean, obviously what you said is true, that the fact that people were in quarantine, they had time to go out and protest.
Mm,
Others had time to reflect. And as you
mm,
know, in the United States and in other places, but particularly in the United States, many corporations made
mm,
statements of affinity with Black Lives Matter and anti-Black racism. But I don't think you can go back from those moments
mm,
and those statements and this energy that has been put forth to rethink what this thing called policing is. I don't think we can go back from that. Now, I'm not saying that everything will change tomorrow, because this change of this oneness of humankind, this using of unity as an organizing principle, is generational in its scope.
Mm.
But every now and then, a moment comes where it can propel us forward just a little bit, and I think this moment is one of those moments. And I'm optimistic.
Well, yeah, well, and it speeds things up at least.
Yes.
Until we see the budgetary games and various other things that slow it down again. But
Right.
As far as the Baha'i experience goes, your religious community has been persecuted in, I'm sure, more than one country, but especially in Iran.
Mm-hmm.
And so does that somehow inspire some of the social justice orientation of the community?
You know, it does. What is interesting, and we've been reflecting on it as a community. We reflect on it from time to time because it's so inspirational. Is in spite of the persecution in various countries, which limit citizenship to almost nothing, the people are so loving in spite of it, so positive in spite of it, and they desire to be positive contributors to the societies and the countries which they live in. And so for us, I mean, looking upon it from the outside, it appears to be, constructive resilience. How, when you're being persecuted, can you not sort of give in to the negativity of it, but still strive to be a contributing factor in a positive way to your community, to your neighbors, to your country, even though it may see you differently than you see it.
Mm-hmm. Well, one positive from my affiliation with the Flushing Interfaith Council in Queens is, learning about the heritage of the Quakers or of the Sikh community,
Yes.
Who are sometimes informed by history of persecution, but an ethic of service. And so it's moving to see those ethics and those values in many forms, but also a commonality. And it's something that I think should be part of education for everyone in an ongoing way. Of course, I don't know, you're from New York City?
I'm a native New Yorker.
Or which borough?
I was originally born in Harlem before gentrification. I like to make that point.
Uh-huh.
And but I've lived most of my life in the Bronx. That's where I am right now in North Central Bronx, which is less than a 5-minute drive from Westchester in the beautiful suburbs.
Mm. It sometimes feels like the UN and New York are in different worlds,
Right.
somehow in the same place but different.
Yeah.
And of course the UN, I think, besides a brief connection with San Francisco, I think the first meetings were in New York. Is that correct?
Yeah, and in various places. Actually, what is now called Lehman College was a site of one of the early. I can't remember which one of maybe the trusteeship council. I don't have that fact right, but they were a site. And what is now Bronx Community College was also a site. So they use various locations around the metropolitan area to have the various bodies meet before the finishing of the site a few years after 1945.
Yeah, and of course there's a connection to Queens as well in Flushing.
That's right.
Well, with the 75th anniversary of the signing of the charter that just passed, it's a little sad that we couldn't do more. But there's it's a time for reflection and renewal, maybe. Now, speaking of reflection and renewal, my producer wants me to break for just a second to give a station identification. So we'll pause for a second. And there we are. Okay. So that's our Justice for All. And again, we're a human rights organization with programs on behalf of the Uyghur, of the Rohingya, of the Muslims in Kashmir, and also interfaith programming with other communities. So we do have a fair amount of activities now engaging with communities of color in the U.S. And alliance building. So as far as getting back to the UN, though, I sometimes feel like I have to apologize for the UN. The UN doesn't need my apologies, but that it has a reputation of just being a sort of dysfunctional club, and that maybe all of us in the NGO community, we're just rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. And so, what are some? I was wondering if you had some thoughts about, how we can really be effective in the next year, assuming that we're still going to be online for a lot of the time.
Yeah. Well, I think we can continue to try to have these positive conversations. So you mentioned that my sister organization, the Baha'i International Community, has a meeting. Their early morning breakfast, they start at 8:30 and go to about 10. But what is interesting about them and unique about them is that they have governments, UN agencies, and members of civil society in as equitable a relationship as it is possible to find in this environment. And everyone seems to enjoy it and find it useful to their work. That's what they say, that they find it useful to the work. And I mean, it's up to them to share what that usefulness is. But these kinds of conversations are, I think, essential to forward movement. As you know, Adam, this sort of broken system that you mentioned the Titanic, in the UN, that's people, everyone says that. It's not like we're saying it. Everyone says that. And so what will be this our moment, our moment like the George Floyd moment was? Will there be a moment will it be a world leader that steps forward? Will it be a government that steps forward? What will happen that will propel the UN forward from this? It's a bit stuck in it because of excuse me, its current operating systems. But you said something, and I told you I used to have these meetings with ambassadors. You said something in your opening that an ambassador told me, and he said, if for no other reason than the conversations we have in the hallway, from the ability for me to talk to another ambassador from a country privately about an issue we're having, off the record and away from the microphones. He said, if there was nothing else that the organization did, it would be worth having. And that's what people don't see. They see the things in front of the mics that are maybe a bit stale, but I can assure you, I've been involved in a few that these off the record, away from the camera and the microphone conversations that ambassadors have with civil society, that ambassadors have with each other, that no one sees or are not in any history books, are valuable reasons for the UN to still exist.
It is striking that a diplomat will speak quite differently off camera and out of the public.
That's right.
And it doesn't mean the public has no value, but it doesn't mean it's the only truth either. And so it's, I hope that even with the Zoom and the other technology, that can continue, during this current health crisis. And it's both, it may open up some new doors, maybe cooperating and participating in events in Geneva will be easier if you don't, you all have an office in Geneva, but we don't.
Right.
And elsewhere. And so maybe there will be some new possibilities that arise. I was wondering if you had any thoughts, though. I mean, we've got the P5, especially the big three who do all the vetoes, that block a lot of important work at the Security Council level, and then a lot of dancing around and trying to find workarounds for that ensues. But what could be? I mean, you mentioned that the question of what is the George Floyd moment at the UN, and that's a very interesting question. What's the turning point?
Right.
And that's a good question to keep. And hopefully it won't be a crisis. We are in a crisis, but then there's the urge to normalize. And I know that the meetings of the Security Council, I believe Russia insisted that they're not on the same level as real meetings,
Right.
and yet they're going on anyway, as if they are.
Right.
So it's really sometimes hard to make out what things mean, but in the work that you do, for example, on women, that's a long-term project, advancement of women's rights, equal rights. I was wondering what your thoughts were in the next 6 months to a year. I mean, how can you keep pushing those priorities forward?
Well, let me answer this. Let me say this first before I answer that.
Yeah.
This came to my mind when you were just talking, is that NGOs, we sit and we talk about what governments can do better, but we also have to talk about what we can do better and how we work together better and how we don't, in some of these conferences where there are so many side events where everyone's promoting their work, maybe we can work together more cooperatively. And certainly some of us come with very important initiatives and things to promote and advocate for. But maybe there's a way we can do it which sort of elevates everyone's concerns together, not separately. And I really look forward to that sort of collaboration among NGOs that I think will forward the work of the UN. In terms of gender justice at the UN, my concern is that it just doesn't involve enough men. And I don't say that because I'm a man. I say that because I work in this field for a long time. And many places that I go, there are many men that are concerned and that work in this area. But I don't know what your experience is, but from my experience is in the UN, it's primarily a conversation with women for and about women. And I look forward to seeing more men appropriately added to the conversation, not taking over, but to be there as supportive constituents of that community. And I know many men are willing and able to do that.
Yeah, I think there's the question of, how can that be done without taking over?
That's right.
That impulse to explain or spread.
Right.
When the CSW conference, one of the main large conferences usually at the UN,
that's right.
When that took place, I mean, we sometimes organize a panel, but it's usually all women.
Yes.
But maybe that's also too easy. Maybe we need to really think about, how to make a mixed panel, which is brings a new dimension in. I mean, then there's also the health crisis. I mean, there's development. There's so many things that the UN is engaged with, obviously, peacekeeping. But as far as the WHO and the US decision, or the president's decision to stop funding all the programs, not just the COVID-19 programs. And then again, the US has withdrawn from UNESCO and is no longer funding UNRWA, the Palestinian refugee programs. There may be others. And of course, we've stepped away from the Human Rights Council entirely, which is why that resolution could pass in the first place. But so I was wondering what your thoughts at this point are about the U.S., the current U.S. Strategy.
Well, what I wonder, my question, remember I was saying in the beginning, maybe what we need to do is ask more questions. I wonder if you think something is not working, but in the past you found it has agency, then how can you change it to something that's better if you're not participating in it? I mean, that's my question. So, and I haven't heard an answer to that. So I don't know the thinking. I get it that, many things in the UN, to the UN's admission, aren't working for the best. But I don't know how you can change them if you're not participating in them. So that's best perceive it.
Yeah, indeed. Well, there are probably other reflections, but I think it's wondered if you had any last thoughts before we finish up in the next few minutes about your work. I don't know if we have any comments from people watching. I don't. I do see here one. Thanks for interesting dialogue. Wish the UN helps with better leaders in government around the world. Yes. And then Mr. Maru Moshari says, Mr. Murrell, this is a great idea. Please start the initiative. Encourage all NGOs to work collaboratively together and versus individually. Yeah, I have to agree. Right. Any thoughts you have about the comments, or there's one in a different language, and I'm sorry, I just don't.
Right. Well, these sometimes, this is all of us, Adam. We're so busy. It's one meeting to another. Now it's one Zoom call to another. And before the quarantine, it was one conference to another one. But maybe we can slow our pace a little, just a bit, and reflect and ask ourselves some of these questions, and maybe stop thinking about our organization for a second and say, who can I work with? Who maybe to see what missions are suitable to your cause, and have just a quiet conversation that is reflective and takes in unity as an organizing principle. And I think, though it is not as fast as many people want, it is a sustainable and lasting result from such a process.
And lots of smart people and idealistic people, and a sense of service. It's really not a bad space, and it's rather a privilege in a way to be able to engage with one's eyes open. But so, well, I hope that we'll get a chance to engage again. And next week we have Bruce Knotts from the Unitarian Universalist UN office, and we'll have a regular schedule of discussions Tuesdays and Thursdays at 4:30 New York City time, UN time. If people want to learn more about the Baha'i, there's the anything you want to add?
Sure. To find out more information about the United States Baha'i community, go to bahai.us. The U.S. Baha'i community just released a statement to all of us about all of us, meaning all of the inhabitants of the U.S., about the current situation of race, and it's, I think, illuminating and interesting. bahai.us.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Carl.
You're welcome, Adam. Thank you so much.